Welcome to Challenging Climate, a podcast where we discuss the science, technology, and politics of climate change. I'm Pete Irvin, a climate scientist.
And I'm Jesse Reynolds, an environmental policy expert. Each episode, we bring on a guest with a unique perspective and deep expertise on climate change and put challenging questions to them.
In this episode, we spoke with Andrew Revkin, a leading science and environmental journalist, author, and educator with over 30 years' experience thinking and writing about climate change and sustainability. He has written at the New York Times and ProPublica, and his current outlet is Sustain What on Substack.
Anyone who follows climate change news and even environmental developments more generally is most likely familiar with Revkin's work. He's really one of the leading journalists of climate change and sustainability. And this conversation that we had with him is what I personally found very rewarding. But to give you a sense of his experience, he's covered really all the key moments in the history of climate change and our policy responses to them. It goes as far back at least as a 1988 cover story for Discover magazine. That was the summer when James Hansen provided his testimony to the US Congress and global warming really broke through as an issue. He was at the 1992 Rio Summit, which produced the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Convention on Biological Diversity. And he was at many, if not most, of the conferences of parties since then, the COPs, as they're called in climate lingo, which led to the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement and other policy developments. And he also helped develop the idea of the Anthropocene, something we've talked about a few times here on the podcast, the proposed geologic epoch during which humans are recognized as a dominant influence on Earth systems.
Yeah, Andy Revkin's career writing on climate spans more than 30 years. And I think what's striking about his writing, and is evident in our conversation, is the constant evolution of his thinking. Relatedly, another interesting thing about Revkin's work is the fact that he's been and still remains ahead of the curve when it comes to adapting to new formats, being an earlier adopter of blogging, Twitter, and podcasting. In this episode, we discuss some of the major turning points in his thinking on climate change, and I think that's quite informative. From his recognition of the resilience of people's beliefs to changing in the face of contradictory evidence on climate change, to the importance of adaptation in responding to climate change, among several other big turning points in his thinking. Now, our wide-ranging and fascinating conversation with Andrew Revkin.
Andy Revkin, welcome to Challenging Climate.
It's good to be with you.
So, are you the journalist who's written the most words on climate change?
Probably not, because if you include books, there are people who have written way more books than I have on this issue. But I've written thousands of articles. I started writing about the human impact on the climate system in 1985 with a story on nuclear winter, which is sort of the inverse of global warming. Although it's become very relevant again, because of Vladimir Putin's nightmarish actions in Ukraine. That was throwing enough stuff in the atmosphere from burning cities in a nuclear war. You could take us back to the cold times, at least the little ice age, if not the big ice age. And then 1988 was my first big cover story on global warming. So that was when it was 350 parts per million. I was in my early 30s. I'm now in my mid 60s. So it was half a life ago. I've been writing since then. My .earth blog at the New York Times, I wrote 2,800 pieces on the blog, along with my articles. Probably 2/3 of those were climate related. So, it does add up.
I started with that question because you were one of the earliest journalists covering the climate change beat, if you will, and you're still here. How did you end up to be a science and environment journalist? What was your path from college to writing about global warming in 1988?
I didn't grow up to be a journalist. When I was at the Times, the New York Times, I was surrounded by people who kind of came out of the womb with a pad and a pen, just people who just wanted to be journalists. And I backed into it. I had a biology degree at Brown University. I grew up in Rhode Island, loving the ocean. Jacques Cousteau was a big influence on me as a kid, leading me toward care for the planet, the oceans. But also I got wet, in Rhode Island. I had my bar mitzvah diving mask and saw the wonders of dancing scallops. The journalism part came after college when I was out in the world. It's a little circuitous, but I ended up being on the crew of a sailboat going around the world in my early 20s. And I saw things that I just felt I had to share with people. I took pictures. I was thinking about photography too at the time. And the need to share what I was seeing and learning, I realized when I got back fit with what we call journalism. And so I ended up circling back to school, Columbia Journalism School, 1981, 82, which is kind of just boot camp for what is a story, what is a lead, what are the ethics of journalism. They still had typewriters. Cutting and pasting was still cutting and pasting. And then I got into magazines and Science Digest magazine first, and then onward.
So in 1992, I think it was, which to put into context, that was the year of the Rio Earth Summit, which I believe you were at, where the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Convention on Biological Diversity were negotiated, as well as the Convention to Combat Desertification. And in that year, you coined the term Anthrocene, which has sort of morphed into Anthropocene. My understanding is Paul Crutzen independently coined that, maybe not. What does the concept mean to you? Do you still think about it? Do you find it to be a useful framing of where the world is at?
Yeah, I mean, I was finishing my first book on global warming. It was late in 1991. I was fishing around to close out a chapter on the human influence on the planet. I had written about the Holocene, the last 11,700 years since the end of the last ice age. And it was one of those moments where you're trying to be artful or whatever. And I just typed out that it just felt to me like we had left the Holocene. And I said, perhaps Earth scientists of the future will look back at this post-Holocene age as a good age or not. And you could call it the Anthrocene. I hadn't been thinking about etymology and word choice. So to me, it wasn't so much the term, it was the idea that we'd left the Holocene. As far as people have seen, that's the first time someone wrote that we were in a post-Holocene period. And then 2000, right, Crutzen and Eugene Stormer, they had never seen my book. It was a companion book to a Museum of Natural History exhibition on climate change, not a bestseller, not a Bill McKibben kind of book. So it wasn't like no one had really absorbed that I had written that until later. And then I ended up on the Anthropocene Working Group for 6 years, 2010 to 2016. This is the committee assembled to adjudicate for the world's geological community whether this is a real thing or not. I wasn't there because I'm a stratigrapher. I was there because of that history. And I think there's still a debate. In fact, before this year is out, the committee will be coming out with the working group is going to be looking for the formal process. Here's the place on Earth where we can put a golden spike literally into the Earth saying this is the layer that starts our human age. I think that technical issue gets mixed up with the arguments over the term Anthropocene. There's lots of questions about whether it's anthropocentric, whether it's hubristic, whether you can blame an entire species for the transformation of the Earth right now, or is it just capitalism? There's some scholars who talk about the capitalocene. No, it should be called the capitalocene. It's capitalists. When they say that, I say, well, what about China? They kind of like are playing a big role in changing the climate too. But that whole discussion I think it's valuable. It's all about the reality that we've entered a new era on Earth when Earth and human histories henceforth are intertwined in ways where the human history was sort of just like any other species until this point. Going forward, whether it's good or bad, whether it lasts a long time, a lot of those aren't technical questions. They're sort of ethical, moral questions. And I just think the debate is fantastic. I wrote a long essay on this in 2016 for Anthropocene magazine, the inaugural issue. And, I said the technical questions are less important than the conversation that has started. So I think it's all great.
We'll put some links to that essay and some other content into the show notes. And what I find interesting about your career isn't just the amount of time or the depth you've been involved in climate change coverage, but it seems to me that you're an early adopter of new mediums or new media. You were one of the earlier environmental bloggers there at the New York Times on .earth. You moved to social media early. I get the sense that you're still defending it as a potential useful place to exchange ideas. You've podcasted a bit, both on your own platform. You're now on Substack, which is a new thing. In a way, it's sort of a return to blogging, I guess. You recently appeared on one of these long form podcasts, this 4-hour conversation almost on Lex Fridman's podcast. How, in your eyes, has the medium affected the message, if at all? Does Twitter shape how ideas are communicated? Does podcast, blogging?
Oh boy, that's a rich set of observations and question. I'll start with the transition first and then get to the utility part. In 2003, for the New York Times, I went to the North Pole. I camped on the sea ice there with scientists for several days. The sea ice floating on the Arctic Ocean. They're trying to understand ocean changes underneath the ice by throwing instruments down to the seabed and bringing them up. It was amazing, it was 2003. The Times had a nascent video unit. I've always had an interest in photography and video and stuff. So I said, hey, can I borrow one of your camcorders? Actually, I brought 2 camcorders, all kinds of stuff, a lot of batteries. It's really hard to keep a battery functioning in 20 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit temperatures, but you stick them in your turtleneck. And so the multimedia part became evident to me there, and I'd been toying with that on some other pieces before then. But what was really interesting was there was a young editor back on the Times website, early 2003, Rebecca de Moline. I was on a satellite phone conversation. She said, let's do a reader Q&A. So basically we did an AMA from the sea ice. And it was all totally low tech. She would just tell me the questions that were coming in. They posted something on the website and she said, so-and-so says blah, blah, blah. And I would recite to her my answer. She would type it in and, it was not on Twitter or anything. And I loved that. I realized I was there to tell the story, to report the story, for the Times. It came out in several different articles in the New York Times. But it was the interactivity. I was like, oh, this is interesting. But in 2005, at the Montreal Climate Talks, I was there just to write articles, right? But I did a blog. I called it The Hot Seat. If you Google for Hot Seat, NY Times and Revkin, you'll find this series I did of blogish pieces. And I did a podcast. I had my recorder to record interviews. And so I was realizing, the sounds of the young people, the climate activists of that day, chanting in the hallways was really interesting to capture. So that, again, got with me. So 2007 came along, and that's when I proposed the idea of the blog on sustainability. And here I went to Greenland. Basically, if you flash freeze the Gulf of Mexico, plunk it up on dry land, Greenland, you end up with this 2-mile high chunk of ice. So I was up there. I wrote a sort of a proto blog, thanks to Len Apgar, an editor, playing with the idea of us doing kind of a blog. And the reason I liked blogging in the context of a challenge like global warming or biodiversity loss or all the issues I was bundling for sustainability is these stories are really a bad fit. These issues are a bad fit for a conventional story. And to get a story on the front page of the New York Times, it has to have a crystalline, frontable, that's the term in the newsroom, a frontable thought. And, when you think about energy transition or resilience to climate change or the social dimensions of policy change, you end up, if you try to fit those into conventional stories, you really miss the story. So the blog felt like I was still writing articles, but it felt like a way to fill in the blanks, and the dimensions of blogging fit the dimensions of the climate problem. It's a social problem, a political problem, a technical problem, biogeophysical problem. And it felt like building a relationship with readers also was the key to keeping my head on straight. One of the other frustrations I was starting to experience as a journalist is what I call narrative capture. There's another term of art for this, the narrative fallacy, which is you get locked into a sense of what the story is. And as a newsroom, I experienced this several times, even on other things. When I had to cover the crash of Flight 800, this disaster when a 747 exploded as it was rising from JFK. And it was a total mystery. But in the air, it had to be terrorism. The New York Times newsroom assumed it was terrorism. Our Washington correspondents were all plugged into the Justice Department at that time. They assumed it was terrorism. And I was reporting the story on Long Island, talking to metallurgists, looking at the wreckage, along with a couple other reporters. And the story we were hearing was not about a bomb or a missile. It was like there wasn't enough energy in the damage to be from that. But it was really hard because the newsroom was captured by the idea it was terrorism. And it turned out to be a really complicated, who knows what kind of mixture of an electrical failure and too much fumes in the gas tank. And I developed this care for avoiding narrative capture. And climate change, there's so many narratives around climate change. And so many people are captured by so many narratives that I felt like, again, looking at it with a more of a blog style lens felt a better fit.
I guess that point makes a good segue into what I was going to ask next, which is you're trying to avoid narrative capture, but what are some of the big inflection points in your thinking over these 30 odd years writing on climate change?
Well, a big one came in 2006 when Al Gore, the movie Inconvenient Truth, had come out. Senator Inhofe was getting pretty hot and bothered. The temperature around the climate issue was really rising. And an editor at the Weekend Review section said, hey, Andy, can you write something on why people are so inflamed around global warming? And I'm quite sure that was the first time I started interviewing social and behavioral scientists about climate change. There probably were one or two others, before then, but they were telling me some pretty scary shit that actually felt scarier than standing on the cracking sea ice at the North Pole. It was that basically there's well-established science that shows that what we believe in looking at a set of facts is not really a function of the facts, a function of our cultural, what Dan Kahane at Yale, cultural cognition. And there was empirical work was demonstrating that scientific literacy, the basic understanding of what climate change is highest at both ends of the spectrum of belief on global warming. And that, for a journalist to absorb that understanding climate change better doesn't clarify and motivate everyone to become more alike, in addressing it, is kind of existential, because what do I do as a journalist? Why am I doing journalism? Hopefully to inform in ways that illuminate and create understanding and maybe some common action. So that work was a profound shakeup for my mental model. And that's also when I started to shift not just toward blogging, but toward thinking about conversation facilitation as a communication tool. It's not a journalistic one, at least not traditionally. But from that point forward, from 2009, I took a buyout at the end of 2009 from the New York Times after 14 years of full-time reporting there. And I went to Pace University to teach, and I continued doing the blog. The blog moved to the opinion side of the paper. But that's when I started to also really get into social media. I started on Twitter, I think December 2007, but I didn't really actively start using it till 2008, 2009, going forward. And these media, particularly Twitter, more than Facebook, seemed a place where you could, if you use them actively, really illuminate further aspects of a question or sources of expertise, or a way to kind of seek feedback that wasn't all trolling and, idiots, to just sort of build a better picture and through conversation to share and shape ideas that can really change things. It's easier for someone to say, hey, great story, than to say, hey, great conversation. But I think that really kind of propelled me further and further away from storytelling, meaning unidirectional storytelling. That was a profound one. In terms of other breakthroughs, I guess somewhere around my 30th year on the beat, 2016-ish, I became more comfortable with climate change, meaning there are aspects of the phenomenon I think are way beyond our conscious and deliberative societal power to change. Energy access is such a prime need, and climate concerns remain secondary, tertiary to that, with the level of that being a function of your wealth or poverty, mostly. Trying to propel the story, global warming, felt less and less useful to me. And this is even as The Guardian and my buddy Bill McKibben and others were pushing this, in another direction, trying to sell the idea of climate emergency or whatever. And I just feel that it's not, and it doesn't mean we're doomed. It's like the failure part. It's just sort of normalizing that this is, well, as Timothy Morton talks about, hyper objects, which are where something that you think is one thing is actually way bigger. That idea really I embrace, because I think the more we normalize the scope of the unfolding that's happening and get away from the idea of solving global warming, or the better off we'll be, actually. Because then you work on the things you can work on. I think we can surprise ourselves on the upside just as much as people talk about tipping points and doom. Just in this conversation on fusion, it's not that fusion is the magic bullet, but I think it's showing us that our capacity to innovate, if put to the right questions, can really be powerful. One thing I do stress is that it's not just technological innovation. We have to innovate socially just as much. Conversation I had with Bill Gates in 2016, he's all about the big breakthrough. And I was asking him, well, what about the guy in India, Harish Hande at Selco, who's innovated a way to go village to village with solar innovations that can help that village right now grind their grain with a solar device. And he kind of, he didn't reject it, but he sort of poo-poos that stuff. He's all about the big win. So to me, the innovation merits that story is very distributed. And that's also harder, that I can't tell that story through the New York Times in a way that will magically make us facilitate distributed innovation capacity in 1,000 ways in 100, 200 countries. But I can think of tools I can work on, as I do here at Columbia, or what I've tried to do with my webcast, that can do some of that work too. You asked about transformational points. There's one more, if I can wedge it in. And this is probably around between 2002, 2009. I started learning more and more about from a field called paleoclimatology. about past patterns of violent weather and prolonged drought and the normal nature of things that we're currently too apt to label unprecedented in journalism, particularly, and in climate campaigns. 2002, there was a paper in Nature by Bierman and others. They had dug into these lake beds across the Northeast, across New England, and they found that there was this unbelievable pattern of extreme scouring flash floods going back through the millennia, through the last several thousand years. And it looked actually from their work like we're slowly entering an era of more of these. And this paper had one line that sort of like quietly was warning, by the way, when we think about climate change, this work will make it more difficult to look for a signal of climate change because it looks like we just haven't been aware of these patterns of extreme precipitation, what's possible in the system. And it just built from there. 2007, another story, they dug into the beaches in Puerto Rico, in Vieques, and found strong hurricanes frequent in cooler periods in the Caribbean. I think that's close to what the headline was. And then along comes Hurricane Maria, the whole climate community is saying, oh my God, this is climate change, this is climate change. And of course, it leads to more circumspection when you realize what these systems are capable of. When we call something extreme, it's just basically because it's at the ends of the spectrum of what's possible. So that work was also really revelatory. And, there were people like Roger Pielke Jr. who were pilloried through that period for pointing out things like this. There was a conscious effort to undermine his credibility. He's reemerged from that recently because the data are strong. And so it just made me more careful too. Just recently on my blog was writing about too often what's labeled a climate emergency these days is a vulnerability emergency that we've built into these areas, like much of Florida, in ways either oblivious to or consciously discounting the realities of hurricane patterns and drought. I kind of drifted pretty far there.
No, that's great. It sounds a bit like we've moved from the era, or your thinking has moved from the perspective that climate change is a singular story into climate change is part of the many strands of our current world's trajectory. It's sort of interwoven into everything in some ways. So zooming out a little bit, I started my PhD in 2009, which I think was on the tail end of an era, if I'm right, in what's called climate communication, climate media, where it felt that there was an ongoing battle with climate denial, outright climate denial, the merchants of doubt, Naomi Oreskes and so on. And that seemed to sort of reach its peak around that point or start to peter out in the 2010s. And I kind of wonder if we're now in a new era where I think at that time, we talked with Elizabeth Colbert about this, that there was a problem in media communication in that they often had a both sidesism to their reporting. And I wonder if now, are we swinging into an era where there's a different communication problem in that it seems most extreme weather gets labeled as being due to climate change? How has the media landscape on climate change evolved, and what were its problems and what are its current contemporary problems?
Yeah, this is such an important point. That's a pretty good way to look at things, that I'm worried in a way. I don't even know. There must be a sociological scholar term for this, but there's like a group Gish Gallop that's been underway for a while. The Gish Gallop being, when someone argues just by throwing every possible flawed thesis into the mix. And it's just a form of debate we see sometimes. Politicians do it a lot. But now there's like a group Gish Gallop in the sense that the media focus on climate change. You're rewarded almost in the newsroom as much as public eye for championing the issue more than staying attuned to what the data show. Well, let's take two components to this. One is when the news is breaking, like Hurricane Michael hit the Florida Panhandle. There hadn't been anything like that. It was an unbelievably devastating hurricane, Category 5. And, it was really written about as the incarnation of global warming. No one paused to say, well, what did we know about past hurricanes there? Which to me would be a fundamental question to ask before you sort of say, this is something that changed. This is climate change. So there's that, just the failure to do the basic journalistic process of what just happened, what do I know about why it happened, what would redress what happened. And so too many headlines come and go, especially in some media. And then you get this political, diplomatic issue, like just out of COP27, loss and damage was the story, right? Loss and damage has been around as an idea for way more than a decade. And the Pakistan disaster, which was a true calamity, became kind of the incarnation of this. And one of the previous treaty talks, it was Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines. And this one particularly, though, I still have not seen a single story that actually breaks down what we know about the flooding that happened in Pakistan, the actual rain event, and then the flood, and then the losses. How much of that can reliably be pointed to as the result of global warming's impact on the monsoon? And how much of it was a function of the huge growth in Pakistan in the last 50 years? It's a country that had 40 million people mid 20th century. Now it's 225 million people, all living on the same landscape. And, I don't want to demean or minimize the horrific impacts that's had on Pakistan's economy, on the local communities. But the basic fact is if the same storm had hit 50 years ago, and could have, given meteorological history there, the impact would have been that much less. It's just that this is the idea of the expanding bullseye. There are two geographers, Steve Strader and Walker Ashley, who have kind of trademarked in a way this way of mapping exposure growth in areas of climate hazard. And actually, they've done it for volcanoes and other things. And it just changes your whole perspective when you look at the question of what happened here, what put people at risk. The dominant factor still is societal. Climate justice is a real thing, but it's not just about global warming and fossil fuels. Climate justice is the reality that unjust economic imbalances put some people in harm's way more than others. But we don't see that reflected in how these events play out. The diplomatic pressure is there to say, yes, we're going to do something about loss and damage. Show me when that actually happens, and I'll be very happy. But the story was loss and damage, loss and damage. So first of all, it's really hard to have a calculation of loss and damage related to global warming from fossil fuel emissions. Second, there'll be 1,000 different arguments for how that gets played out. Who does the money go to? So that's discouraging. That's just the old thing that we were always told not to do as journalists, which is stenography. If you just quote Pakistan's prime minister saying, this flood is all the rich world's fault, and journalists would just quote that and not actually ask the question, do we really know that? Stenography is not what journalism is about. But that's where that narrative capture would kick in. It's like, oh, global warming, rich country, poor country, villain and hero. Those are traditional journalistic frames that are very easy to fit some stories into unless you dig into the data and then you realize, oh, this is actually complicated.
So one of the things that we've talked about a bit on this podcast, I was quite shocked by, and I'm not sure what your perception is of this, but one of the consequences, I think, of this change in the media landscape around climate change is what appears to be a real rapid growth in the sense of pessimism and worry among young people. We've quoted various statistics of a fraction of people in the UK, young people in the UK, who think they are doomed due to climate change, or who their lives are going to be hampered in serious ways. What is your sense of that? Are these surveys right? Are we missing something? And what responsibility do media organizations have? Or is it something to do with the new media promoting certain kinds of messages, regardless of their source?
This is tough because, as I said earlier with cultural cognition, you could put all the facts into an article, you can reshape your homepage or your social flow. But if there are those out there who are willing to exploit the worst aspect of social media or online or video journalism or the like, that will be the thing that was more apt to cross someone's screen if they are worried. We self-select. We are algorithmically hijacked toward the more dramatic. And people would just skip the more nuanced stuff. And I think, unfortunately, we're in a stage now where for a certain sector of young people and some older people, that doomist scenario matches some aspect of a personality or the like, such that you can glom onto that. I'm a little frustrated with and I've tweeted about this, and I did run a couple of sessions on this. There are funders who are pouring multi-millions of dollars into A22 network, which is essentially doing these various soup throwing and airport sitting. And I'm not saying people shouldn't follow their passions, but if you're fomenting or sort of nurturing that, actively financing it, thinking it's going to lead to progress on global warming, then I think there's a responsibility there. And this is a lot of money now. It's not like fossil fuel money that was flowing in the other direction, but it's millions of dollars. And we've seen already the art campaign has very effectively gotten on a lot of screens. What's sort of sad about it is, well, actually, someone from Climate Emergency Fund, Margaret Salomon, she was on my webcast, and she said, look, we know this is going to piss off a lot of people. That we're not funding it for those people. We're funding it because we know we'll recruit more passionate edge pushers. So we're locked in now where the thing that's seen as efficacious by the people funding this process, getting a few more marginal people who have doomist view of the world, who are willing to risk prison by sitting on a highway. They kind of know that that's actually inflaming more resistance and mainstream critiques of climate action. But they're like measuring a different factor for their success, which is getting more marginal people involved. And I don't see that going away. That shows you the limits of what all of us do who are trying to sort of keep a rational, effective approach to some of this.
I want to circle back to a name you mentioned earlier, Roger Pielke Jr., and as well as your podcast that you appeared on Lex Fridman's podcast with Bjorn Lomborg. And those figures and others are sometimes grouped as lukewarmers, who make clear that climate change is human caused and poses real risks to society, but have various sources of hesitation around all-out mobilization and restructuring of society and economy to prevent climate change. And in the world in which at least I operate in, and Pete too, and perhaps you, we professionally operate in a little bit of a green bubble in which the lukewarmers are characterized as the new denialists. Not only do they muddy the waters, but they do so dangerously, is the common message that I hear. But I'd like to ask you, Andy, what do we, those who generally advocate for climate action, have to learn from so-called lukewarmers like Lomborg and others?
That's a really good question. That 4 hours with Lex, it's so hard to measure impact and because the social feeds around it were full of the same. Lomborg was being hammered by Twitter replies and stuff for being too reasonable. So peel away those kind of useless layers of reaction. I saw quite a bit of reaction saying there was a certain refreshing quality to having a sustained discussion, illuminating, different dimensions and views without resorting to the win-lose model. I was actually frustrated that Lex labeled it a debate because it really wasn't. It was just open discussion. And I was there as much to simply have that conversation with Lex about it, where my differences and similarities with Lomborg were. What can we learn from them? Well, Lomborg and Pielke are very different. Lomborg, too quick to use a simple cost-benefit analysis to make his judgments. If you have $10 to spend them on tuberculosis medicine, not on climate change. We're not in a zero-sum. We're not in a either-or world. This came out in my discussion on fusion. If you gesture for fusion or gesture for fission or gesture for renewables, none of that's going to get you to the energy future that we'll actually have. So he's resorted to a simplicity that I think isn't helpful in the long run. His new book called False Alarm, which is clearly designed to cut back to the sort of yes, no. Yeah, we talked about it on the show. I'm pretty sure I'd said that wasn't an apt title. So some of this is marketing and salesmanship, and he's benefited tremendously from having his ideas expropriated and amplified by politicians. Pielke, to a larger extent, I think, has stuck with the data. He can be prickly, and he's also appeared as a Republican witness at many, many hearings. But I really deeply respect his research. I mean, my God, he's one of the most cited peer-reviewed researchers on disaster losses and climate policy. And I wish there was a way for us being, I guess, as you described, those of us who are serious in realizing how important climate change is, to not feel we have to sort of diminish the other faction in order to gain a foothold for our own chosen path. There was another revelation I had that's relevant. There was this concept called response diversity that came out of ecosystem studies that I stumbled on in 2011, 12, when the blogosphere was getting overheated, and David Roberts, now at Volts, he was at Grist, and he and Bill McKibben were all on my case for having kind of a nuanced view of the Keystone Pipeline. That was when it was kind of being pressed on Obama as something he had to embrace, stopping it. And I thought the politics of that was dangerous for Democrats at the time. David wrote something, and I was kind of thinking, why can't we all get along? And so I was Googling for like environmentalism, diversity, where you can acknowledge the different dimensions. And the thing that came up was this paper by Thomas Elmqvist from Stockholm Resilience Center from like 2003 on response diversity in ecosystems. And basically what they were finding was that ecosystems that had more resilience to an environmental stress were those that had species that could have more than one reaction to a stress. So the species making up the components of an ecosystem being pummeled by drought or whatever. If within that species you can have more than one response, that's good for resilience. And I thought, wow, that feels like it would be good to have it in society too. And I wrote some stuff about this, and there has been some scholarship, some research trying to assess whether this quality leads to social resilience as well as ecological resilience, but it's still early days. The impediments, though, to having this play out in our modern system for policymaking are really large, because here with the Inflation Reduction Act, when you have federal opportunities and you're in the renewable energy space, how do you acknowledge the role for nuclear while trying to make your case in society for big deployment of solar as being the thing? It's really hard to figure out how to engage these multiple views of an argument. And so Lomborg and Pilkey and the like, I guess one of the lessons is that certainly in Pilkey's cases, he's arguing from the facts and or the lack of facts. Uncertainty, known uncertainty is a fact about how hot it's going to get by 2100. And I kind of run out of steam when I think about how that can play in our politics, which is so much about win-lose, not about nuance. It crystallized, I guess, around the Manchin Inflation Reduction Act permitting reform dynamic, where, I was writing creditably about the compromises. My buddy Bill McKibben was, as soon as there was the Inflation Reduction Act, a bunch of progressives said, we have to kill this permitting reform package, which was promised as part of the negotiation, because it's got this pipeline that in Manchin's state, et cetera. And lo and behold, at least for now, they seem to have done that. And you can't have this mass deployment of renewables without a lot of evolution of around the regulatory landscape. How that can play forward, I don't know. But see, so it was kind of defeated, and then the partisanship was there. The strategic need to demonize and use that as a way to retain a focus on a particular solution feels really hard to figure out how to untangle.
In one of our recent episodes, we asked the question, is 1.5 Celsius still alive? And there was some reluctance to sign the death certificate. But I do wonder, you have to be very imaginatively hopeful about just how flexible the world is to assume that it's still possible. And I think some of the dynamics you were describing earlier of the tricky social dynamics mean that it's hard to anticipate a very dramatic shift in the world, the kinds of dramatic shift in the world that would be required to meet 1.5 Celsius. So what are your thoughts on that? Could 1.5 Celsius still be achieved? And is it even reasonable to think about that goal?
Well, the simple answer is no. The more nuanced answer is getting away from the idea that we can achieve something. The difference between 2 and 1.5. Energy, as I said earlier, energy needs trump climate concerns, period. And we've seen this play out this past year because of Putin, with forcing Europe to recognize the utter failure of having stayed dependent on Russia for natural gas. But more so, the impact across the world of these spikes in energy prices and shortages on everything from fertilizer in Malawi to food prices everywhere. And this tells us pretty clearly that constraining energy opportunity, if that's the tool for the difference between 2 and 1.5, is fantasy. This actually would be on my list of other revelations. The more time I spent in developing countries looking at energy needs, the more respect I've had for the reality that fossil fuels will have to play a significant role in certain parts of the world, particularly in advancing societies, getting them out of deep poverty, just as China has already done. The message out of Glasgow that all finance for fossil fuel development was going to stop, with some tiny little wiggle room statement about some special needs. Think about that from the standpoint of sub-Saharan Africa. It was no wonder that half a dozen leaders of those countries were saying this was a new form of colonialism, that, you're trying to impose on us your global high-level constraints, impeding our right to develop using fuels that we have here that you're already using. So that's one reason I think 1.5 is fantastical. I had a conversation with Johan Rockström this year, with an African journalist, an African energy person, and an American scholar who's of African descent. And Johan Rockström, who's like the ultimate green, planetary boundaries scientist, said that we have zero right to constrain the low emitting half of the planet, 3 or 4 billion people. The high emitting societies have to cut their own emissions way, way, way deeper. And the carbon space is a real thing. It's not like, actually, he said you can fit it into a 1.5 trajectory. But his numbers were that the rich Western, Northern emissions reductions would be like 30 times higher than they are now. But it's doable, and he would say ethical to do that. So you add that all up. And of course, the other question is, does 1.5 matter? The 2-degree 1.5 thresholds, if you really scratch the skin of a lot of climate scientists, they'll tell you what's been clear for a long time. It's a political decision. This is not an end time precipice number. It's about trajectories going toward amplifying long-term risks. And that takes me back to, if the world got honest about cutting the vulnerabilities that exist to flooding, to heat, to storm, et cetera, to agriculture in places that have the deepest vulnerability and the most exposure, that does give a lot more wiggle room, a lot more time for the decarbonization side to play out. But I don't think we're seriously engaged there either. This is way before loss and damage. In Cancun and before in Copenhagen, there was this $100 billion a year commitment by 2020. That didn't come about. Who thinks? I would love to see the concept of national security for the United States and developed countries much more firmly integrate global security, meaning secure populations, securing them from harms that will then lead to instability and migration pressure. If we could just trim even 5% of the U.S. defense budget and put it more into USAID and reducing instability at the root, then you could see a lot more potential for the world overall in a changing climate. Prosperity is probably the strongest driver of climate resilience. So fostering basic capacity for literacy, for economic well-being in places that are still struggling to get through the day is a climate policy and a sustainability policy and a security policy. Finding a way to have that work out, and not necessarily within the constraints of a climate agreement, feels logical to me. That's a hard story to sell, though. We also tend to kind of like use the tools that are at hand. That's why a lot of things have been tried under the Framework Convention on Climate Change that really aren't about climate. They're about bigger issues, decolonization, reparations. There's all kinds of reparations that theoretically are owed somewhere. Africa, the developed world owes Africa a lot for having split it into all these components that have had these structural challenges to develop. But trying to wedge that into the climate agreement, I think is not constructive.
So is climate change crowding out some other environmental issues that we should pay more attention to?
Yeah, I think so. 2001, I think I had this conversation with William Clark, who was a Harvard sustainability science pioneer. And I never wrote this up. It was one of the stories I felt, damn, why didn't I write that up? This is 2001. And he said he felt like the climate story was taking up all the oxygen in the wider sustainability debate. And, carbon fixation on emissions takes away the focus on reducing risk at the root. Emissions building the atmosphere, changing the climate is only one driver of risk on the ground, whether it's an ecosystem or a community. And I think he's been right about that. I wish I'd written that story at that time. I'm not sure anyone would have read it. But so, yeah, I think it has consumed more of our attention than what has suffered as a result. I guess I've said this more than once in recent years. If back in 1988, when I wrote my first big story, the year that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was constituted, it probably could have been a more effective path through these intervening decades if it had been the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Risk, not climate change, with climate change being one driver of risk. All the science has been in there, but the framing has put the change in the climate system at the front of the story, as opposed to the thing society's most, normally fixate on, which is risk. Are we at risk? Who is at risk from climate impacts? That really puts the climate justice, climate vulnerability part in the foreground in a way that gets missed. Even the way these IPCC reports roll out, the first one is the physical basis, and that gets the most headlines. It's worse than we thought, global warming. The second one is impacts and adaptation. By then, the media are kind of like zoned out. And that story also kind of gets muddled, as I said earlier. If you're just thinking about it as adaptation to climate change from CO2 in the atmosphere, you're missing the vulnerability drivers. And then finally comes the working group 3, the policy. What do we do about it? And by then, it's kind of a snooze. And that's also the area of the most spin and the least science. So there's still work to be done. I think if we focus on climate risk, if I could have a pocket card for any climate concerned investor or journalist or community member, it's this thing I put out recently, the formula for risk. Risk is the hazard, flood, fire, tornado, drought, times exposure, how many people, how much stuff in harm's way, factoring in vulnerability or resilience. And so if you look at any event or any trend with that framing, sure, climate change is changing some hazards in ways that worsen risk. But for many climate hazards, it's complicated. Like tornadoes, there's no clear climate signal. Heat is pretty powerfully understood now, but vulnerability to heat is what kills. And, you have thresholds going forward, but I interviewed the most prominent researcher at the interface of heat, health, and climate, Christy Ebi at University of Washington. And even now, she says climate change is super important. She's on the IPCC But she says no one needs to die in a heat wave, period. She said that like many times. No one seems to want to listen to it because what it requires is going down the block in your town, rich or poor, and finding out who's vulnerable to heat. And it's usually not you. It's a poor homeless person or a retired couple who can't afford to run their air conditioner, even if they have one. So they tend to die in a heat wave, even when they could have lived. And that requires social cohesion, all kinds of things that are harder to measure than carbon. So that an exposure is simply how many people and how much stuff. And so it just changes the formula toward getting things in order. The cumulative long-term nature of carbon dioxide makes it very special, like extinction. Things that have long-term outcomes have to rise in prominence just beyond just the simple formula for today. But discounting that formula then leads to lost opportunities to really reduce the impacts that we all care about.
Well, we usually like to end on a hopeful note or a hopeful question, like what gives people hope. But I think we're asking something slightly different. Do you think in 50 years' time, the world will be suffering more from extremes of weather and climate or less? Will the impact be greater or smaller than today?
Oh, I'll have to give the facile answer that most people would, which is it depends. It depends on how we direct our resources today. Clearly, sea levels will be rising for centuries to come, barring either a huge sustained volcanism, something that chills the climate. We could have a whole nother 2-hour session just on geoengineering, which I don't think is going to happen in any meaningful way in that time frame. But it depends, if the world got serious about recalibrating investments that are now made for security into resilience and global security and well-being, if we sustain the work on post-carbon pathways, not just for fusion, but for fission and for deployment of today's renewables, the emissions, the climate change component, I think will become more manageable. And the vulnerability reduction absolutely is a function of both societal and technological innovation that are happening. They're never happening well enough. Just think between, let's say, 50 years. Yeah. In the last 50 years, Bangladesh went from losing several 100,000 people in cyclones to several dozen. And this is in a world of greatly increased population in Bangladesh. So that's just one signal of what's possible. And that's through things like radio warnings and Twitter. Actually, there are Twitter flood apps now in Jakarta, Indonesia. So there's just huge possibilities to surprise ourselves on the upside with vulnerability reduction. So I'd say we have good odds that climate will be changing for sure, but there's ways to build capacities locally and globally that can make it a much less calamitous journey going forward. And there could be some downside surprises. I dug into all the tipping points, and most of them are really positive feedbacks. They're not tipping points. Meaning the things, if you keep getting worse, if emissions keep rising, it makes the risks of these things rise. But there's no end time aspect to this. I think the planet is going to come through this pretty well. On sea level rise, I kind of put my money where my mouth is. We moved to Maine. We bought a house that's about 100 yards from the coast. It's about 16 feet above high tide. And I'm confident it'll be here for my children, maybe my grandchildren. And they could also just move it back from the coast if they need. So it's like, I wouldn't have done that if I really thought there was a high probability of a 10-foot sea level rise by 2100. So We'll see. So someone can come here to Lemoyne, Maine in 2070 and see how it all played out.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us, Andy. Where can people find more of your stuff?
These days, revkin.substack.com and at Revkin on Twitter and youtube.com/Andrew Revkin, I think.
Excellent. Well, thanks a lot.
Sure. Thank you too.
Well, thanks for listening. Please rate or review us on Apple Podcasts and elsewhere, and consider supporting us on Patreon. That's patreon.com/challengingclimate.